Hello. We are going to talk about the latest book review, which is Always Time for Coffee. That's the cover. I happen to read it on Kindle. Some of the leadership book club read it in print because that's their preferred, and some listen to Audible. I suppose one of my first things about this book that I loved was the picture of the coffee cup on the front. So that's a good place to start. So the premise of the book is quite a simple one. And it's about the idea that we should have meaningful conversations and make time to have conversations with people in informal settings. Some really great examples about why coffee shops, the fact that the author loves coffees, but also the idea of moving away from formal settings. Now, the Leadership Book Club are quite advanced readers and have a really diverse range of leadership experience. And so this book is targeted at frontline managers. So Always Time for Coffee is really good for a frontline manager. It's also good if you're trying to get a sense of 101s, what you need to do, what you need to think about as a new manager. A couple of things that I think were inherent in the book that we didn't really think about was one, the hybrid setup. So in a hybrid setup or in a remote working environment, what is our alternative to time for coffee? Can we really get that comfort that we get from in-person coffees with people? And if we don't, are we creating more of that proximity bias, that there's a bias because we're near somebody? The other thing that kind of concerned me about the book, and it's not actually a criticism of the book because the book does what it says on the tin, it does it really well, but from an inclusion point of view and an inclusive leadership point of view, I started to think about the mechanisms that the author was speaking about. So the mechanisms of having these conversations, of creating informal settings, of creating connection. It got me thinking about how they're the same mechanisms that set up the boys' clubs or set up cliques or set up in groups. And during the book club, we kind of talked about that a little bit. What are the alternatives? What do we need to think about in order to make sure that while we use something that is simple and good foundational concepts, and I have to say, I know these, I've seen them for years, most of the readers in the book club knew about them too, but agreed that they helped them think about them again and help them thinking about the responsibilities that the people that report into them have. So even for really experienced leaders or really well-read leaders, there's quite a few academics in the group. There is an appreciation that this book was clear, concise, gave some various different examples that were more diverse than some of the other books that we've written, talked about some really good core concepts, and that they were really good, even though they were experienced leaders and well-read, that actually they acknowledged that it was nice to be thinking about them again from this point of view and not just maybe their original point of view. Now, the book is written for frontline managers, ultimately, or supervisors. And I would say generally really, really helpful. But there's a piece here, which is how does that translate into hybrid or remote working? How does that replicate some of the mechanisms that end up creating cliques or boys clubs? And what do you do when your teams are bigger than being able to have coffee, that you could actually be in coffees all week long? And it got me thinking about how sometimes we need some really good core, strong foundations as leaders and managers that you then adapt and evolve for your environment. And I suppose what this book really got me thinking about was how often the basics aren't taught, which the author speaks about quite a bit in the book, is how often we promote people into leadership or management positions. She's talking about primarily frontline management positions without really developing the skills or supporting the development. And that even when there is development, sometimes it's out of tune with the reality of those people's experiences, or the people doing the teaching don't really understand the pressure on the front line and how reactive you have to be as somebody kind of facing the public or facing your clientele or facing your customer or facing your patient. So I really love that the author really understood those things. And I think generally it's a really good starting place and probably a really good place for people to come back to and say, okay, maybe I'm a more senior leader, maybe I'm not frontline. Am I doing these things well with the people I need to have really strong relationships with? If I am doing these things well, great. But if I am doing these things well, is there anywhere that I'm creating bias or privileging a particular way of being? The other thing I want to say is the book was beautiful to read. It was just like easy, digestible, practical, lovely read. It was just good, easy read. We then also talked about how do we give it as gifts or recommend people read it without it seeming like an insult. And there was a couple of different ideas about how you might recommend a book to somebody that's on your team in a way that is seen as helpful and supportive rather than like an obligation or a criticism or a dig or having some kind of hidden message in it. So I think that the book was a great pick for the book club. It had more diverse examples than previously, and while it's targeting at frontline and more so new managers, it's got some really good concepts and practices. And I would say we also need to be careful of those practices and concepts just to make sure that we don't start replicating cliques and in groups. And we also talked about when is coffee not a good idea. So I spoke about how some issues have to be dealt with through a formal route, because while you can assume that everyone you're working with is on the same page, unfortunately, I'm not that naive anymore. And a lot of the work I've done with different managers, leaders, and organizations has demonstrated how employees have utilized those one-on-one coffees in a couple of ways that they weren't intended to be used. So one of the ways was basically having a couple of coffees with different people, recording it, and then bringing it through a formal case. But each person that they'd had coffee with was a manager, believed it was informal, wasn't taking notes. They were taking notes, and now they have a collection of 5 or 6 managers that they've had conversations with. And so it's important that while we need to have conversations, we need to remember that we're still at work. The other example I gave around that piece is that actually maybe that informal coffee isn't easy for people. So neurodiversity, introversion, relational styles, attachment. There's loads of reasons that having a coffee with someone may be more or less effective with different people. And that wasn't really considered or addressed in the book. It was assumed that relating to people is the solution. And while my work and everything I do is highly around relationships, we also have to acknowledge that that is not the best way to work with lots of people. And so we must consider that in our decision making. And I gave an example about how I got on really, really well with someone very early in my career, really, really liked working with them, like adore the person, fantastic person. But we had nothing in common at that time in my life. And so whenever we had a coffee, even if we were discussing work, there was always an awkwardness before and after because we didn't share something. And while this person was trying to be really reasonable with me, because they had coffees and informal chats with the other colleagues who were closer to them in age and in other things, had more shared life experiences happening, they were trying to be equal by making sure that they met us all for coffee and had those conversations. The reality was ours were awkward for both of us, I would imagine, and didn't naturally flow because we were in different stages of our life. So for me, in that setting, it was much nicer to have a formal meeting about a topic than to have an informal coffee, for instance. And just to take into account that there isn't one right way to do everything. And while I think the book is really good, I think it misses that a little bit, and that it would be naive not to consider that your informal conversations, or even if you're off site, you might think are quite innocent or just cordial or just developing a relationship. But because the relationship is linked at work, you need both parties to have that intention for it to be effective. Otherwise, a party can use that positive attempt of yours in a negative way. And there's loads of cases of this, and I'm sure you're aware of it yourselves. Equally, not to assume that, always time for coffee and sitting down with people is the only way people want to communicate or is the only right way to do it. Lots of people, we know generations are having different experiences. We know different preferences for communication. We know different things being effective for different people for lots of reasons. Doesn't make that always true. And the assumption that it's always true can actually create a bias that you weren't intending to. And we just need to be a bit more reflective on that when we're thinking about what we think is good management or good leadership. We also need to think about who does this suit and who might this not suit, and just to have that extra lens to think about that. I also think it is important to keep in mind that approach can also allow you to privilege certain people more than others because you might have more in common, or it might be easier for different reasons to have those conversations. And so just remember that there can be a proximity bias that occurs that you might want to be managing. Is it easier to have this coffee and chat with certain people more than other people, and so on? So just to keep your mind open to those things and to be considerate of them when you are approaching the book. I would say read the book, regardless of where you are, whether you're pre-management or supervision, pre-supervising, pre-management, pre-leadership, or whether you're post and you're like, oh yeah, well, I know all that stuff. everyone reading it had already heard of these things, already knew about these things, practiced a lot of them, and they still thought the book was valuable because it was a reminder of what their direct reports might be experiencing. And also a reminder that, which was an interesting piece, a reminder that some senior people that they might have thoughts about might be doing their best as well. So it kind of humanized the leadership and management conversation in a different way to some of the previous books that we read. And so while it is a simple read, I'd say it's a good gift to give people. I would say we just need to keep a little eye on the assumption that conversations are always the right way to do it. They're always going to be used the way that they're intended to be used. And then that you are managing any proximity bias or any like me bias where it's easier to have coffee with some people than others. And I suppose maybe my last piece of advice is, A, read the book. I think it's worth a good read. They also did a really good job. It's really good examples, really digestible. However, I would also say if you're reading it, it might be worth developing what's called Work With Me book, which is where you start to say the best ways to work with you. And if you can normalize that and get the people you work with to normalize that for themselves, then you will be able to know if coffee is what they need, or they need a standing up chat, or they need you to talk to them when you walk instead, or they need you to put it in an email, or they need it in bullet points, or they need examples. If you A, read the book, and B, develop a work with me document as you're reading the book, and maybe encourage your team and people around you to develop a work with me document, you're going to find that you probably manage most of those possible challenges that this approach may bring up. That kind of the shadow side of what I think is a really good set of principles and practices. Actually, you can mitigate some of those challenges or shadow side to the book by working through a work with me document. So if you want to know how you can read a book effectively, or how you can take your leadership books from the bookshelf into actual transformation and impact, then sign up for the link below. I have a really good document on it. But also remember that I am launching a book called Inclusive Leadership Navigating Organizational Complexity. The link's below. And I send out leadership letters, which have different development resources for different leaders at different stages of their journey. And so click below. If you liked this video, like it, leave a comment, share it, tag people in it, because that really does help. So if you're listening on the podcast, please go back and comment, like, answer the poll question. If you're listening on YouTube, like, share, tag people. And if you're listening on social media, do all of the above. Thank you very much.